In the landscape of the United States federal criminal justice system, the vast majority of cases do not proceed to a full trial. We are talking about an overwhelming prevalence. Over 95% of all federal criminal matters are resolved through a negotiated plea agreement. This reality dictates how we must approach the study of criminal procedure and sentencing for the bar examination. This video series will explore the mechanics of this negotiation process, the plea bargain, and subsequently examine the complex sentencing framework that governs the final outcome for the defendant. Our focus will be on understanding precisely how these agreements are structured and how they directly influence the application of the sentencing guidelines. To begin, visualize the system itself. The path taken by nearly every case heavily favors resolution outside the courtroom, tipping the scales dramatically away from a formal trial. Now that we understand the prevalence of plea agreements, we must dissect their structure. There are three primary categories of negotiation. First is charge bargaining, where the prosecutor agrees to dismiss certain counts or reduce the charges filed against the defendant. Second is sentence bargaining, which involves the parties stipulating to a specific sentence length or agreeing on a narrow sentencing range for the judge to consider. The third, and often most critical for guideline purposes, is fact bargaining. Here, the defense and prosecution agree on the underlying facts that will be presented to the court for calculating the sentencing guideline range. Finally, we must note the cooperation agreement. While often bundled with a plea, this is a distinct tool where the defendant agrees to assist the government in investigating or prosecuting others, usually in exchange for a potential sentence reduction motion later on. Understanding these distinctions is vital because they determine the scope of the final judicial review. Now that we understand the structure of the negotiated agreement, we must examine the judicial gatekeeping function required to finalize it, the plea acceptance under Federal Rule of Criminal Procedure 11. The Constitution imposes strict requirements here. The court must affirmatively determine that the defendant's plea is knowing, voluntary, and intelligent. This is not a mere formality. It ensures the defendant fully comprehends the consequences. Crucially, the defendant must explicitly waive several core constitutional protections. These include the right to proceed to a jury trial, the right to confront witnesses against them, and the right to present evidence in their defense. Rule 11 outlines a mandatory checklist the judge must follow to confirm these constitutional waivers and factual bases are established before the plea can be accepted. We summarize these essential Rule 11 inquiry points on the screen. Having secured the judicial acceptance of the plea, we now transition from the negotiation phase to the critical sentencing phase. The framework governing federal sentencing was fundamentally altered by the Sentencing Reform Act of 1984. This act created the United States Sentencing Guidelines, or USSG, with the primary goal of promoting uniformity and reducing unwarranted disparities across federal judicial districts. Initially, these guidelines were intended to be mandatory. To understand how they function today, we must grasp their original structure. The guidelines are organized around two primary axes that intersect to produce an initial sentencing range. These axes are the offense level, reflecting the seriousness of the crime and adjustments, and the criminal history category, reflecting the defendant's past record. We can visualize this historical shift on the screen, marking the move away from the older system of indeterminate sentencing toward the era where these guidelines held mandatory force. Now that we have identified the two critical inputs, the offense level and the criminal history category, let us examine how they combine using the United States Sentencing Guidelines table. The offense level is the starting point. It begins with a base level determined by the specific statute of conviction, found in Chapter 2 of the Guidelines. This base level is then modified by specific offense characteristics and defendant-related adjustments, such as acceptance of responsibility or role in the offense, detailed in Chapter 3. This results in the final offense level, typically ranging from Level 1 to Level 43. Simultaneously, the defendant's prior record is assessed to place them into one of 6 criminal history categories, ranging from Category 1 for those with minimal history to Category 6 for career offenders. The intersection of the calculated offense level on the vertical axis and the assigned criminal history category on the horizontal axis pinpoints the initial advisory sentencing range, expressed in months, found within the grid itself. This grid is the core mechanism for determining the starting point for judicial sentencing. The grid we just examined previously yielded the initial sentencing range. However, the mandatory nature of those ranges was dramatically altered by the Supreme Court in the landmark case, United States v. Booker, decided in 2005. Booker held that mandatory application of the United States sentencing guidelines violated the Sixth Amendment right to a jury trial because judges, not juries, were determining facts that increased the sentence length. Consequently, Booker severed the requirement that judges impose a sentence within the calculated guideline range. The guidelines became purely advisory. This shift fundamentally restored significant judicial discretion. On appeal, the standard of review also changed. Instead of reviewing for mere procedural error, appellate courts now review sentences for reasonableness under the authority granted by Title 18, United States Code, Section 355. 3 subsection A. This reasonableness review is the cornerstone of modern federal sentencing practice. Now that we understand the guidelines are advisory, we must examine how a judge moves away from that calculated range. There are 2 primary mechanisms for deviation: departures and variances. A departure is a move authorized specifically by the guidelines themselves. These are typically governed by policy statements found in Chapter 5, Part A, such as Section 5K1.1, which allows for a downward departure based on substantial assistance to the government. In contrast, a variance is any deviation from the advisory range that is not based on a specific guideline policy statement. Instead, variances are justified by the judge's consideration of the factors listed in Title 18, United States Code, Section 3553 subsection A, the same factors used for the overall reasonableness review. Crucially, both departures and variances are subject to the statutory flaw. If a statute mandates a minimum sentence, that mandatory minimum overrides the advisory guideline range, regardless of whether a departure or variance is sought. The key distinction lies in the source of the authorization for the deviation. To conclude this overview, we must synthesize the 2 major components we have explored: the procedural reality of plea bargaining and the substantive framework of sentencing guidelines. Remember this crucial connection: the specific facts stipulated within your plea agreement of the direct inputs used to calculate the initial offense level. This offense level, combined with the defendant's criminal history category, mathematically dictates the advisory guideline range. This range then serves as the mandatory starting point for the judge. Only after establishing this baseline does the court proceed to consider the factors under Section 3553 subsection A, which justifies any subsequent variance or departure. Therefore, success on the uniform bar examination requires mastery of both the procedural fairness inherent in the plea process and the rigorous, substantive calculation of the resulting sentencing guidelines.